The transfers have reportedly included heavy conventional weapons such as battle tanks, armored combat vehicles, combat aircraft, helicopters, large caliber artillery systems, missile systems, and uncrewed combat aerial vehicles, as well as remotely operated munitions and small arms and light weapons and their ammunition. There have also been reports of states transferring or planning to transfer weapons such as uncrewed aerial vehicles, ballistic missiles, and ammunition to the Russian armed forces, and that those weapons have been used and are likely to be used in Ukraine. Needless to say, any transfer of weapons and ammunition must be compliant with applicable international legal framework, including, of course, relevant Security Council resolutions, which in certain instances impose sanctions and restrictive measures on such transfers. Reports related to the use and transfer of cluster munitions since the beginning of the conflict and the widespread contamination with mines and explosive remnants of war in Ukraine are deeply concerning. The universal participation in and the full implementation of the Convention on the Prohibition of the Use, Stockpiling, Production, and Transfer of Anti-Personnel Mines and on their destruction, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons must remain a priority. I call on all states to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations and to become parties as a matter of priority to disarmament treaties and complying with obligations therein. Compliance with those obligations is crucial in preventing the causing of unnecessary suffering or superfluous injury to persons and in protecting civilians. In today's challenging security context, it is more important than ever to reaffirm the value and importance of international humanitarian law. Madam President, importing, transit, producing, and exporting states must act responsibly at every step along the arms and ammunition transfer chain to prevent and detect diversion, illicit trafficking, and misuse. Pre-transfer risk assessments, marking and record-keeping practices, as well as tracing and investigation capabilities are of utmost importance. Effective physical security and stockpile management of arms and ammunition, as well as customs and border control measures are also key. To prevent diversion of conventional arms and regulate the international arms trade, states have established a number of arms control treaties and instruments. This includes the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons and its International Tracing Instrument, and the Global Framework for Through-Life Conventional Ammunition Management. Universal participation in the relevant treaties, as well as full and effective implementation of these treaties and instruments, must remain a priority. Madam President, hostilities and attacks continue to severely impact civilians and civilian infrastructure, including energy, health, education facilities across Ukraine. Since 24 February 2022, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, has recorded over 11,700 civilians killed and more than 24,600 civilians injured in Ukraine. According to OHCHR, August was the month with the second highest number of civilian casualties in 2024, after July, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured in Ukraine. The use of armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles by the Russian Federation continues to cause civilian deaths and injuries, as well as damage to civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. In addition, there have also been reports of a number of cross-border strikes using missiles and uncrewed aerial vehicles by Ukraine inside the Russian Federation, with some resulting in civilian casualties and damage to civilian objects. Armed uncrewed aerial vehicles and missiles must not be used in a manner inconsistent with international humanitarian law. The use of explosive weapons in populated areas should be avoided. Their use continues to kill and injure thousands of civilians, including children. In addition, they expose civilian populations to severe and long-standing indirect harm, including from the disruption of essential services. The continued and intensified attacks affecting civilians and civilian infrastructure are deeply concerning. All parties to any armed conflict have an obligation under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Civilians and combatants must be distinguished. Civilian objects and military objectives must be distinguished. Attacks must not be directed against civilians and civilian objects. Indiscriminate attacks are prohibited. Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council, the United Nations will continue working towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and relevant General Assembly resolutions. I hope that the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly serves as a moment to mend eroded trust and contributes to find solutions to bridge the political divides and end the conflicts that are causing so much death and suffering. I thank you very much for your attention.
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, the meeting convened by us today on the Western arms supply to the Kiev regime and their role in undermining the efforts to find a peaceful settlement to the Ukrainian crisis allows everyone who wishes to have a good idea about the real situation regarding this. Since our last meeting, the situation has significantly deteriorated. And this was predictable given the paltry situation of the Ukrainian army that's losing town after town, not only in eastern Ukraine, but also in the area of the Kursk region that they captured in August. Ukraine and its Western backers are looking for the wonder wafer that could break the situation on the battleground. The doomed Ukrainian chief wasn't helped by Leopards, Abrams, Bradley, nor long-range artillery, nor long-range HIMARS, ATAMS, stored shadows, etc., etc. Enormous hopes were pinned on the provision of F-16 fighters, but Ukraine has already lost one. According to the American media, the Ukrainian army has used up almost all of its atoms, and there were several hundred given by the US to the Kiev regime. The UK media is reporting about losses of Storm Shadow stockpiles. Now there have been reports about forthcoming supplies of American JASSM missiles to the Ukrainian army that are better functioning than the French Scalp ones and the UK Storm Shadows. The modifications of this missile of the ground to air can get targets 800 kilometers away. Our Western colleagues, however, are not forgetting to talk about the hostilities in Ukraine because they bring them great profit. Thanks to Ukraine, other problems are being solved. As we see from the UK press publications, the UK gave to Ukraine a large amount of military assistance that needed to be disposed of, and this information was provided by auditors. The expenditure of this country on the disposal of old equipment decreased from 3.5 billion to 223 million. So as you can see, this is very convenient. Given this, there are increasing reports of the use by Ukrainian nationalists of chemical weapons. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainian armed forces continue, with the consent and under the leadership of Washington and London, to systematically use toxic substances and chemical riot control agents in the area of the special military operation. More than 400 cases of the use by Ukraine of toxic chemical substances, in particular chloropin, which is on Annex 3 of the Chemical Weapons Convention, along with chlororetifen. Such incidents have occurred in Donetsk, in Bogdanov, Gorlikovka, Kremensk, Artyomovsk, and most of them have been confirmed by an accredited laboratory from the Russian Defense Ministry. Furthermore, there were 17 cases of the use by Ukraine of chemical components to poison food that caused the death of 15 people. According to civilians, the Ukrainian army, when attacking the Kursk region, used shells with an unidentified gas, and animals died as a result. The Russian side also recorded cases of the use by Ukrainian army of chemical substances such as bezet, hydrogen chloride, and also CS, the Terran 6, with other chemical components. And these are part of the Ukrainian Army Storm Unit. We're concerned about the Ukrainian Army's statements about the existence of phosphorganic components and Tabun JA that is in Annex 1 of the CWC. Furthermore, we'd like to point out that we are still waiting from the US, a country on whose territory there is the only BZ production facility, as explanations as to how they were made available to the Ukrainian people in Zaporozhye region of Russia. The Russian side is establishing cases of chemical uses in violation by Ukraine of its obligations under the CWC and is investigating this in line with the requirements of the OPCW based on accredited organizations of the Russian Defense Ministry. In terms of investigations into this and other cases of the use of toxic substances and riot control agents by Ukraine, the Russian Federation is continuing to inform the OPCW and the UN Security Council of these cases. The scale of the production of such substances in Ukraine has reached such a scale that dangerous chemicals are poisoning the Siem River and the Dniester River. There has been mass deaths of fish, and this is threatening Kiev as well. But the authorities are doing everything they can to hide this fact, and in fact, they're pinning the blame on Russia. But in fact, this is very difficult to do. So we would advise those living in Kiev to be extremely cautious in using drinking water. The links between the Kiev regime with global terrorism are growing. We see the Zelensky clique helping terrorists in the Sahel, and we found out about that in the last meeting on Western weapons supplies to Ukraine from the PR of Mali. As you all recall, these actions and the statements of Kiev are things that have led Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso to cut off diplomatic relations with Ukraine. Furthermore, as we've heard from Turkish media, in the end of June in Idlib, there was a meeting of representatives of Kiev with the terrorists from the Security Council listed organization Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which the Zelensky regime continues to provide with drones in exchange from the release of a number of radical anti-Russian fighters so they can participate in hostilities against Russia. Madam Chair, the most worrisome, however, trend recently is becoming clearer, and we think it's extremely important to draw the international community's attention to the situation. For some months now, the conspirators in the crimes of the Kiev regime have been discussing an issue about providing Zelensky with a carte blanche to use Western weapons supplied to it to strike targets deep within inside the Russian Federation. As a reason for this, there is the baseless insinuation regarding the supplies, apparently, of ballistic missiles by Iran to Russia that has been absolutely rejected by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Iran. The active campaign has been headed up by the head of the neo-Nazi junta. As we all understand, he's very interested in this scenario because de facto it would involve the US and its allies along NATO in the conflict. The recent meeting of the contact group to assist Ukraine in the Ramstadt format recalled the attempts again to allow Western sponsors to authorize geographical strikes in Russia. There is something absolutely astonishing here when they're talking about trying to encourage Moscow to uphold peace. In Kiev, there was a decree about a ban on conducting negotiations with Russia, and that is still in place. I'd like to remind you that we have never rejected negotiations, and we're always prepared to discuss with Kiev and its Western backers ways to eradicate the reasons causing the SMO in February 2022. Zelensky is also not scared to openly express his disappointment with the fact that the backers have not yet allowed him to strike the Kremlin. Today, we can say assuredly that the decision to lift restrictions on the use of military equipment for long-range strikes into Russia by the West has basically been taken, and we are seeing the final step of this legitimization right in front of the international community. In terms of relationships with Kiev, this really doesn't change anything for us. The neo-Nazi regime has long struck outside its territory, conducting terrorist attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure of our country. However, this potential development of the situation fundamentally change our relationship with the Western camp. If the decision to lift restrictions is really taken, that will mean that from that moment, NATO countries are conducting direct war with Russia. In this case, we will have to, as you understand, take the relevant decisions with all the consequences for this that the Western aggressors would incur. So washing its hand of responsibility and pinning all the blame elsewhere is something that our Western colleagues are not going to be able to do. Because we have intelligence, they say that there is intelligence from US and EU satellites. NATO military will program missile systems. We're not talking about allowing Kiev to strike long range into Russia, but rather about taking a decision to have direct strikes in the West. What the Ukrainian nationalists whether they actually formally press the button, we're not talking about a game here. The facts are that NATO will be a direct party to hostilities against a nuclear power. I think you shouldn't forget about this and think about the consequences. The Western strategy, as we see from the US Defense Ministry documents, say that the Pentagon recently asked for a modeling of the potential impact of a nuclear war in Eastern Europe. The US has, we can see quite clearly what these discussions are based on. Madam President, without the support of the West, Kiev would never have decided to have this thoughtless invasion into the Kursk region. And we are actively pushing back Ukrainian units, so there have been a lot of losses. Many of the Ukrainian army units participating in this incursion into our country are using intelligence provided to Kyiv by Western countries and equipment provided by them and strike weapons that have been provided by the West. The Ukrainian army is failing in Donetsk, and so the Kiev chief junta basically has caused a punitive campaign against against civilians in our country. There are ongoing strikes of villages and towns with the use of various types of weapon, and this is being done deliberately, ignoring deliberately the norms of IHL and understanding that whatever he does, the West will never condemn him. We have numerous witness statements that within the villages controlled by the rebels, concentration camps have been set up. Civilians are forcibly pushed there, those people who've not had the opportunity to be evacuated. So in the Sujans boarding school, Sela, there have been about 70 to 100 civilians who were subjected to moral attacks, and this is something that was reported on. These journalists not only illegally crossed the Russian Federation border, but they actually did this as part of the Ukrainian army units. So they are deliberately becoming part of the Ukrainian propaganda regime. In particular, we're talking about The Independent, the UK, and the Deutsche Welle from Germany, and TGI from Italy, and LT, Latin Times, Hot News, and 1+1 from Ukraine, and also American CNN. All of these, just trampling on their journalist ethics, have become co-conspirators with the warping of reality and are covering up information about the crimes committed against civilians by Ukrainian rebels. So it's quite easy to find on the internet real evidence that shows what the Ukrainian army is doing to civilians, marauding, plundering, looting. But of course, you're never going to see photos and videos of that on CNN or Fox News. The truth about what is happening will never be broadcast. Their main concern, that of Western politicians, is just to maintain the international community being concerned. Madam President, what is happening in Ukraine, the violations of civilians' rights and freedoms, does not need to be described. Western leaders are pretending not to notice this, but the Ukrainians in their publications are starting to call their country a concentration camp on behalf of Zelensky. This is something that means that Ukrainians can't even leave their own country, but sometimes they can't even leave their own homes because there would be violent mobilization. And so they would be thrown into a pointless and terrible meat grinder, all to serve the geopolitical interests of this horrific Ukrainian dictator. So what we are seeing is that Ukraine is becoming a testing ground, not just for military equipment, but also for political maneuvering. The collective West is testing the reaction of its societies to violations of very basic human rights that the West itself seeks to uphold and proclaim: a ban on elections, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, religion, the use of one's native language, and the incorporation of somebody else's culture. All of this experiment is being conducted right now in Ukraine. Given this, right at the head is the U.S. Secretary of State. We see from him that there's this initiative for Ukrainians and Americans to have a dangerous escalation. But this is being bandied about as assistance to Ukraine in overcoming the problems caused directly by the Russian act of aggression. Things are being warped. There's the actions of the Ukrainian army that have led to an expansion of the area of hostilities to peaceable Russian regions, and Washington is deeming this to be self-defense. The attempts of the US to help Ukraine and a desire to do this and to help it stand on its own feet militarily, economically, and democratically mustn't fool anyone. We're not going to go into depth on that, but we just want to look at the situation facing the Libyans, the Iraqis, and the Afghans. These are just a few examples. how they have coped with the liberator, America, destabilization, economic destruction, human suffering and pain. These are results of Washington's attempts to so-called help other countries. And exactly the same thing is happening with Ukraine. And its inhabitants are increasingly being aware of this. Don't be fooled. The only country whose interests the American elite are upholding and that really should be standing on its own feet militarily, economically, and democratically is the US itself. Even if that means the entire rest of the world is destroyed, you need to be blind in order not to see that. And so you need to understand how awful this is, and Washington's prepared to do anything. If somebody, for various reasons, tries to pretend that all this is not his or her problem, then tomorrow is going to be too late to change anything. We do hope that everybody sitting in this chamber and everybody who is following our meeting will give this an extremely good, hard think. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for your briefing. Wow, that was quite a bit of propaganda and lies. It's quite amazing what we just heard. The United States welcomes the opportunity to address the seriousness of weapons transfers into the conflict in Ukraine, which Russia started. Transfers to the aggressor are enabling the largest invasion of Europe, in Europe, since World War II, prolonging the conflict, undermining the UN Charter, and endangering European security. Since the last briefing on this topic, we have new developments to share with the Council. In late 2023, Iran and Russia signed a contract for the supply of hundreds of missiles Russia needs to carry out its aggression in Ukraine. This past summer, Iranian personnel trained Russian military personnel on the use of Iran's Project 360 close-range ballistic missiles. This month, Russia received the first shipment of hundreds of these missiles from Iran. The missiles have a maximum range of 75 miles, and their deployment enables Russia to preserve its longer-range capabilities for use throughout Ukraine, deepening Russia's arsenal and giving Russia the ability to destroy more of Ukraine's infrastructure ahead of winter. Iran's transfer represents a dramatic escalation and a highly destabilizing development, one that is likely to increase the suffering of the Ukrainian people. This missile transfer is in addition to the thousands of UAVs Iran has sent to Russia since 2022, which Russian forces have used with devastating effect against Ukrainian civilians and civilian infrastructure. The partnership between Russia and Iran not only poses a threat to Ukraine and European security, it also directly enables Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East and around the world. In response to Iran's ongoing military support to Russia, including the recent delivery of ballistic missiles for use against Ukraine, the U.S. Department of the Treasury is designating 10 individuals and 6 entities based in Iran and Russia and identifying 4 vessels as blocked property that are enabling Iran's delivery of weapons components and weapon systems, including the UAVs and missiles, to Russia. Since the Kremlin launched its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has also imported dozens of ballistic missiles and more than 18,000 containers of munitions and munitions-related materiel from the DPRK, in violation of Security Council resolutions that Russia itself supported just a few years ago. Russia has cynically abandoned its support for the principles of nonproliferation and has used its position on the Security Council to attempt to shield the DPRK from UN scrutiny of its unlawful nuclear and ballistic missile development programs. It is clear there is an urgent need to help Ukraine defend itself from missile strikes, attacks which undermine the principles of the UN Charter and threaten international peace and security, including, it seems, food security. Just yesterday, Russia hit a civilian wheat cargo vessel in the Black Sea, which was bound for Egypt. Building an integrated air defense capability for Ukraine is a priority for us and others, and it is clear from these attacks that we cannot let up. We are going to work with Ukraine to ensure they have the capabilities needed to defend themselves against Russia's missile and drone attacks. Let me comment on our joint desire for peace. The fastest way towards peace is for Russia to withdraw its forces from Ukraine and for it to stop its aerial assault. Absent Russia's desire for peace, the next quickest way towards peace is for the world to cut off Russia's ability to sustain its illegal assault. This is where we need to have a real conversation about China's role in this conflict. China is prolonging Russia's aggression through its so-called no-limits partnership and its large-scale support for Russia's defense industrial base, all of which enable Russia to continue waging war on Ukraine. China's transfer of dual-use materials such as weapons components, equipment, and raw materials serve as inputs for Russia's defense sector. These exports include nitrocellulose, machine tools, microelectronics, optics, UAV and cruise missile technology, which Russia is using to kill civilians and destroy Ukrainian infrastructure. How can China be for peace while it enables Russia's war? China is also helping Russia spread propaganda and disinformation about Ukraine by justifying the war through the pretext of legitimate security concerns. There is no legitimate excuse for what Russia is doing in Ukraine. None. Then there is China's six-point peace proposal for resolving what China calls the Ukraine crisis, which is not complementary to Ukraine's peace formula and omits support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Does China intend to reward Russia for violating the UN Charter? China's six-point plan would create a dangerous precedent. We are not here to reward violators of the UN Charter. We call on China, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, with a particular responsibility to uphold the UN Charter, to respect the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to cease all material and political support to Russia's illegal war. Colleagues, there is no justification for Russia's attack on Ukraine. Ukraine has an inherent right to defend itself from aggression, as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter, and the United States will continue to support Ukraine's ability to do so, and to ensure Russia is not rewarded for violating the UN Charter. We are not alone. We join the efforts of UN member states from all geographical regions of the globe that stand with Ukraine's democratically elected government. We will not back down. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also extend my gratitude to High Representative Nakamitsu for the timely briefing. Since the outbreak of war in Ukraine, the Republic of Korea has been consistent in condemning Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. The reason was simple: because Russia's invasion was in violation of our guiding fundamental principles, among others, the principle of non-use of force, which have underpinned international peace and security and steered this organization over the last 7 decades. My country was not only one calling on Russia to change its course. Indeed, thus far, the UN General Assembly has adopted 6 resolutions condemning Russia's aggression, affirming the clear illegality of territory annexations, and calling for just and lasting peace in Ukraine, supported by an overwhelming majority of member states. All the while, this Council has been paralyzed on the Ukraine situations. As we approach the high-level week of the 79th session of UNGA, we deplore that the repeated calls from the international community have not been heeded by Russia. Rather, we are witnessing a major escalation of the war and expansion of fronts over the past weeks. My delegation hopes this year's timely UNGA high-level gatherings can serve as an opportunity to revitalize our collective commitment to upholding our common values. In this regard, my delegation is appalled by yesterday's killing of 3 ICRC staff members who were planning to distribute humanitarian aid in eastern Ukraine as a result of Russian shelling. Humanitarian workers must be protected, and their activities should be ensured. We also reiterate our strong condemnations of Russia's continuous indiscriminate attacks against the civilians and civilian objects, particularly the destruction of energy infrastructure. Indiscriminate attacks against civilians are prohibited under international humanitarian law, yet Russia's ongoing use of DPRK weapons is causing significant damage to civilians and civilian infrastructures in Ukraine, and further compounds the cruelty of this invasion. In this connection, we are deeply concerned that Russia's use of North Korean ballistic missile is increasing in both frequency and intensity. A Ukraine military research institute recently confirmed that debris from the missile used to attack Kiev in August were of North Korean origin. Particularly, the North Korean leader's recent vow to exponentially increase its nuclear arsenal, ignoring this Council's resolution, will surely depend upon outside support. As such, we urge Russia to immediately cease its military cooperation with DPRK, which violates multiple Security Council resolutions. And we once again call on Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. Then violation of the UN Charter will end, and so will prolong the suffering of innocent people in Ukraine as well. Madam President, it is our firm belief that any peace deal should be in accordance with UN Charter and international law to achieve just and lasting peace in Ukraine. As Russia began this war in violent violation of those very rules, it is obvious who holds the keys for connecting this situation. On our part, the Republic of Korea supports the international community's efforts to navigate a direction forward to end this war and restore lasting peace in Ukraine. We will also continue to stand with Ukrainians until they overcome the current hardship by providing vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I too begin by thanking High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. It is deeply regrettable that the Russian Federation continues to try to justify its aggression and flagrant violations of international law and the principles of the UN Charter by calling for repeated meetings on the delivery of Western arms to Ukraine. The reality is completely different. The truth is that Ukraine is facing an existential challenge and has been fighting for its survival since February 2022. In recent weeks, we have seen the intensification of missile and drone attacks by the Russian Federation across Ukraine, including Kiev. The sobering briefings we have heard in this chamber confirm that the suffering and death toll in Ukraine continues to increase. Ukrainian civilians continue to suffer the brunt of this unjustified and unprovoked war. More than 10 million people had to flee their homes. Unrelenting attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, in particular on energy infrastructure, will have a direct impact on Ukraine's social and economic development and on preparation for the upcoming winter months. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. More than 14.6 million people require some form of humanitarian assistance. Access to aid remains difficult, while the working environment for humanitarian workers remains perilous. Also yesterday, 3 staff members of the ICRC were killed after shelling hit the site of a planned frontline aid distribution in the Donetsk region. We strongly condemn this blatant disregard for international humanitarian law. This Council must reiterate in no uncertain terms its call on the parties to uphold IHL and the principles of distinction and proportionality. Madam President, turning to the issue at hand, the transfer of arms, Malta is deeply concerned by the recent transfer of weapons from DPRK and Iran to Russia. A number of these transfers are in clear violation of Security Council resolutions and will further escalate the current situation. They also represent a direct threat to European security. To conclude, we cannot forget that Ukraine is not the aggressor. This must be at the forefront of our considerations. This war can end if Russia chooses to immediately and completely and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. This is the only path towards a viable and sustainable peace. Until that day comes, it is completely unrealistic of us to expect Ukraine not to defend itself from this aggression and not to seek the assistance of its allies. It has every right to do so, as does every other member of the United Nations, in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter. I thank you.
The representative of Malta for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. And I also thank High Representative Ms. Nakamitsu for her comprehensive briefing. There is no change in our position that such Security Council meetings as this, routinely requested by Russia, are nothing but a waste of time and resources of both the UN and the international community. Russia seems to want to discuss solutions to the problem. However, there is only one problem that needs to be addressed immediately. That is Russia's violation of the UN Charter. Our stance is clearly articulated in the resolution adopted by an overwhelming majority of the General Assembly on March 2nd, 2022, which I quote. The General Assembly deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter, and demands that the Russian Federation immediately cease its use of force against Ukraine and refrain from any further unlawful threat or use of force against any member state, end quote. Russia has continuously ignored this resolution and violated numerous international laws to further its aggression. Russia has procured ballistic missiles from North Korea, which is a violation of the relevant Security Council resolutions which Russia itself voted in favor of, and also reportedly from Iran. It continues its attacks on Ukraine, causing immense civilian casualties and destroying civilian infrastructure. Russia is claiming that international support for Ukraine is a problem that needs to be solved. This is a clearly opposite argument, and it is entirely unacceptable. Today's meeting is yet another attempt by Russia to divert attention from what it is actually doing in Ukraine. Members of the Security Council and the broader UN membership should not allow themselves to be distracted by such tactics. They should also make themselves clear in stating that Russia is the one to be blamed before they talk about solution to this brutal war initiated by Russia. Moreover, all UN member states must refrain from supporting this aggression directly or indirectly. Madam President, we emphasize again that rewarding an aggressor by not making it pay the price cannot be a solution. Such an approach undermines the UN Charter and could potentially lead to future aggression. Our consistent stance that peace in Ukraine must be in accordance with the UN Charter is not mere rhetoric, but a firm determination to protect the very foundation of international order based on the rule of law. We reiterate our strong demand that Russia immediately and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine and reaffirm our commitment to continue supporting Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا السيد.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank the Under-Secretary General, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, for her comprehensive briefing. Allow me at the outset to once again express Algeria's deep concern regarding the flow of arms and ammunition to conflict zones, including the conflict in Russia and Ukraine. Time and again, Algeria has noted that the flow of arms and ammunition to areas of conflict and wars will only fuel the fire and escalate tensions. It will impede every effort to find a peaceful solution for conflicts. The spread of some arms, such as mines and different types, is not only a short-term threat, but it also remains for decades, even after the end of a conflict. Unfortunately, there were many incidents that led to the death of civilians because of the explosion of such weapons during and after conflicts. On another hand, the flow of arms and ammunition to areas of conflict and wars increases the risk of having such arms and ammunition fall into the hands of extremist, criminal, and terrorist groups, increasing their ability to carry out hostilities mainly against unarmed civilians. On that basis, I would like to stress the following points. 1. All parties need to prioritize the protection of civilians and strictly comply with the rules of international law, including the international human rights law. International humanitarian law. Since its beginning, this conflict led to the death of thousands of civilians from both ends, including women and children. It also displaced millions of people who fled areas of confrontation in very difficult circumstances, exposing them to hunger and harsh weather, especially during winter. 2. It is important that all parties ensure that such weapons do not fall into the hands of criminal and terrorist groups. They have to comply with their relevant international obligations. If such arms fall into the hands of such groups, this will be a major threat and risk, not only for the region, but also to international security. 3. Once again, we call for wisdom and restraint from all sides of the conflict. We call upon them to steer away from confrontation and conflict, to end the bloodshed of both civilians and soldiers. If fire is the language of arms, leading to killing and destruction, dialogue is the language of diplomacy, and it definitely leads to peace and stability. For this reason, both sides of the conflict, as well as the international community, must promote their efforts to provide a conducive environment for a constructive and comprehensive dialogue and negotiations leading to a peaceful solution for this conflict, a solution that is based on the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, a solution that takes into account the legitimate security concerns of both sides, away from any polarization which only leads to extending the conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Undersecretary and High Representative Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. Sierra Leone takes note of the call by the Russian Federation to discuss the increase in weapon transfers by the Western countries to Ukraine, which in their view aggravates the crisis in Ukraine and undermines the prospects of its resolution. We also take note of Ukraine's cited imperative to protect civilians and the rights to self-defense. Sierra Leone continues to reiterate its principled position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations should occur within the applicable international legal framework and relevant UN Security Council resolutions, and include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification to prevent diversion of arms and ammunition. Madam President, outside of the transfer of weapons issue, we have observed with concern a dramatic escalation in the conflict in Ukraine since March this year. The consequences of this escalation have been devastating, with intensification of missile and drone strikes, causing increased civilian deaths, injuries, and displacements. From the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine report of 9th August 2024, July was recorded as the deadliest month, with at least 219 civilians killed and 1,018 injured in Ukraine. August also saw very high casualty levels of at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. The Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented a total of 35,865 civilian casualties since the start of the conflict, including at least 11,662 deaths and 24,207 injured, while noting that the true figures are likely to be considerably higher. UNICEF has also confirmed that over 2,000 children have been killed or injured in Ukraine since the start of the conflict in 2022, highlighting that the number of child fatalities this year has increased by almost 40% compared to 2023. Sierra Leone is also concerned about the effects of the spread of hostilities on civilians in Russia's Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions. Reports from local Russian officials indicate that since Ukraine's incursion into the Kursk region in August, at least 12 people have been killed and 121 injured. Additionally, over 130,000 people have reportedly been evacuated from the area. Further, on 10th September, Russian officials reported a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack on populated areas in Moscow, resulting in 1 death and damage to housing facilities. The attack resulted in the closure of 3 of Moscow's airports for several hours and diversion of almost 50 flights. Sierra Leone reiterates that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Madam President, we're deeply concerned about the worsening impacts of the conflict on civilians and civilian infrastructure, which continue to deteriorate at an alarming rate, particularly in Ukraine. According to OSHA's situation report, 14.6 million people, roughly 40% of Ukraine's population, need some form of humanitarian assistance. Entire neighborhoods and villages have been decimated, leaving millions displaced internally and in other countries. Reported attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure since 2024, March, have drastically reduced the country's electricity capacity, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages, often lasting many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks and internet, and public transportation. Older people, persons with disabilities, and many school children who attend school online have been particularly affected by these disruptions in essential services. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about this development as Ukraine approaches its 3rd winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine, as verified by numerous agencies, including UNICEF and OCHA, underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to de-escalate tensions and pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate de-escalation and cessation of the hostilities. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation within their internationally recognized borders, and genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I wish to thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her briefing. For the 19th time, Russia is convening this council to debate the role of Western arms supplies to Ukraine. Nobody will any longer be surprised to see Russia disguising reality, attempting to pass off a state under attack, Ukraine, and the countries that support it as it seeks to exercise its right to self-defense, pass them off as those responsible for extending this war. No one will be taken in by this distortion of the facts. Russia alone decided to have this war by invading Ukraine. On the 16th of March 2022, the International Court of Justice ordered Russia to immediately suspend its military operations in Ukraine. On several occasions, the United Nations General Assembly, by a vast majority, has condemned this aggression. Let us recall that Russia can every day choose to halt this aggression without prejudice to its own security. If this war drags on and if its devastating human toll continues to increase, it will be because Russia is failing to heed these appeals. 2 days ago, it continued its campaign of mass strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. In so doing, it sought to undermine the morale of the Ukrainian people. On the 26th and 27th of August, it staged one of the largest attacks since the beginning of the war. Because we're meeting here to discuss arms supplies, let us recall that Russia, in order to get hold of weaponry, does not hesitate to ride roughshod over the very foundations of the international non-proliferation regime, which is the guarantor of our collective security. Russia is acquiring weapons, ballistic missiles, and munitions from North Korea in flagrant violations of resolutions adopted unanimously by the Security Council. Ballistic missiles produced in North Korea have consequently been used to strike Ukraine, as they were in Kharkiv last January, or yet again very recently in July and August in cases that have been documented. In exchange for that support, Russia is ratcheting up its military cooperation with North Korea that could allow Pyongyang to further develop its ballistic programs and its WMD programs, with grave repercussions for regional and international stability. Russia had also chosen since the very beginning of the war to acquire armed drones from Iran in violation of Resolution 2231. Iran's military support for Russia's war of aggression has just stepped up further, escalated further, with Iran's export of ballistic missiles to Russia. France staunchly condemns these transfers. These stand as a direct threat to European security and will allow Russia to continue its campaign of destructive strikes in Ukraine as winter draws near. We call upon Iran to put an immediate end to these transfers. In line with the manifold warnings issued to the Iranian authorities, we are working with our partners to provide an unequivocal response to these weapons transfers. Namely, we're going to work to designate individuals and entities involved in Iran's ballistic missiles programs and in the transfer to Russia of ballistic missiles and other weapons. France urges all states not to provide Russia with dual-use materials and components which would simply give fuel to its war machine. Madam President, France remains at Ukraine's side and will provide it with support for as long as it needs in all areas in order to allow it to defend its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We will continue to seek a solution to this conflict which is in accordance with the fundamental principles of the Charter. That is the only basis possible for a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for her briefing. Ecuador is concerned by the risks posed by the ongoing supply of weapons and munitions. We support the recommendations set forth once again by the High Representative regarding the measures necessary to mitigate these risks. On the issue that under consideration today, I will make 5 points that I deem important. 1, the sovereign rights of states to self-defense must be upheld in stringent compliance with the provisions of Article 51 of the UN Charter. 2, the transfer of weapons and munitions must adhere to the applicable international legal framework, including the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. 3, it is paramount that we adopt effective measures to prevent the diversion, illicit trade, and improper use of arms and munitions in order to avoid sowing greater instability and insecurity in Ukraine and in the region. Also, to avoid these weapons reappearing and causing damage in other regions of the world, including my region, Latin America. 4, it is necessary to prioritize the protection of civilians as well as the goal of achieving global stability. That must be placed above any other rationale which seeks to further industry production or distribution. 5, we are alarmed by reports regarding the use of anti-personnel mines and cluster munitions, as well as by the impact of widespread contamination by explosive remnants of war. It is vital that we see the comprehensive implementation of the Convention on the Prohibitions of Anti-Personnel Mines and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Madam President, we are concerned by the fact that the situation in Ukraine and the region continues to worsen. Increased violence is fueling a cycle of destruction which, as we've heard, is disproportionately affecting the civilian population and which is posing serious risks in terms of escalation. Ecuador consequently insists that parties have to avoid the use of explosive weapons in populated areas and keep fighting away from urban areas. We want to firmly condemn the Russian attacks which claimed the lives of 3 members of the ICRC while they were simply doing their work. Humanitarian personnel must be protected and their work must be facilitated in accordance with Resolution 2730. Madam President, to conclude, if we can be sure of something, it is that peace cannot be built on the basis of the use of force and weapons. Rather, it is built on dialogue and cooperation. As such, this Council must unite in the quest for peace. We recall that the only viable solution to this conflict involves a process of dialogue, a process which respects the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and which is in line with the principles of the Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to start by thanking Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for her briefing. Madam President, the ongoing conflict between the Russian Federation and Ukraine continues to have profound and far-reaching impacts. We are deeply alarmed by reports of escalating hostilities, including the multidimensional impacts thereof at local, regional, and international levels. We convene today for the second time this week to consider the situation in Ukraine with no meaningful progress on the ground. While the frequency of our meetings underscores the gravity of the situation, the Security Council's current inability to implement decisive measures in fulfilling its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security is a matter of significant concern. This protracted conflict in Ukraine, exacerbated by an escalating arms race, risks expanding across Europe. There is a likelihood of arms diversion to criminal and terrorist networks worldwide. Furthermore, long-term threats to affected communities will persist beyond after the silencing the guns. As we consistently emphasized, Mozambique recognizes the sovereign right of states to self-defense as enshrined in the UN Charter. We acknowledge that the exercise of this right may include, among other measures, arms transfer. However, it is our firm belief that, if not carefully managed, arms transfer can lead to devastated consequences. These may include conflict escalation, increase in security, and ultimately diversion of resources from critical social sectors to sustain military efforts, as evidenced in this conflict in Ukraine. We therefore call on all member states to honor their commitments under relevant international instruments. Furthermore, we urge all member states that have not yet done so to adhere to all relevant international instruments, such as the UN Register of Conventional Arms, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Firearms Protocol, the Programme of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons, amongst others. Such adherence would promote greater transparency and accountability to the flow of weapons. We emphasize that transparency in arms control is an indispensable confidence-building measure which may contribute to re-establishing the much-needed credible communication channels toward the resumption of direct negotiations. We reiterate our appeal that end transfer of weapons and ammunition must be consistent with the applicable international legal framework, including relevant Security Council resolutions. Madam President, we strongly urge all parties to strictly adhere to their obligation to protect civilians and to ensure full compliance with international humanitarian law. It is our view that to be effective, all mitigation measures, including arms control, should not be viewed in isolation, rather as complementary to other necessary measures, including the political initiatives. Therefore, we firmly believe that the only viable path to ending this conflict now, entering in its third year, is through political negotiation and dialogue, based on the Charter and taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties. In conclusion, Madam President, Mozambique continues to urge the conflicting parties to actively pursue de-escalation measures and achieve a ceasefire and establish the foundation for sustainable and lasting peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, for the update provided. Guyana remains gravely concerned about the mounting civilian casualties in this war. We deplore the recent shelling of an aid distribution site in the Donetsk region that claimed the lives of 3 Red Cross staff. We demand that the parties to the conflict uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, including by taking constant care to spare civilians, humanitarian workers, and civilian objects from harm, and grant safe and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for all in need. We were deeply distressed to learn yesterday of the missile strike against a ship carrying over 26,000 tons of grain in the Black Sea, and continue to stress the need for a peaceful end to this conflict. We also continue to demand full adherence to the principles of the Charter of the organization. Madam President, over 11,000 civilians in Ukraine, many of whom were women and children, have had their lives cut short in a war that appears to have little regard for their protected status. Briefer after briefer has warned of the grave violations being committed, including with weapons, which by nature are indiscriminate, and thus their effects cannot be limited as required under international humanitarian law. Several reports indicate that most civilian casualties recorded to date were caused by the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas, such as artillery shells and rockets, bombs, missiles, loitering munitions, and other explosive munitions dropped by unmanned aerial vehicles. Some of these weapons not only represent an immediate threat to civilians during a conflict, but pose a danger to lives and livelihoods long after the conflict has ended. I speak here, Madam President, especially of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, which can remain dormant and in the ground for decades. As a state party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions and Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention, among others, Guyana calls for full compliance with international law and international disarmament instruments and obligations. We also emphasize, as has the United Nations Office on Disarmament Affairs on many occasions, that conventional arms and ammunition are at risk of diversion throughout their life cycle, and even more so when they are transferred into an armed conflict. Guyana continues to urge that all transfers be conducted within the existing international legal framework, including UN Security Council resolutions, and with adequate controls in place to prevent their irregular transfer. In conclusion, Madam President, we maintain that any lasting solution to this conflict will not be achieved through military action or a cycle of meetings that proffer no solutions nor yield concrete outcomes to change the situation on the ground. It must be done through diplomacy and good faith negotiations, conducted in accordance with the provisions of the United Nations Charter and international law. It is this Council's responsibility to put an end to the cycle of violence and pain. Guyana, therefore, reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and urges the parties to commit to a political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. Colleagues, by calling this meeting today on Western weapons transfers to Ukraine, Russia has, yet again, succeeded only in drawing our attention to its continued hypocrisy. Just days ago, it came to light that Russia has received Iranian ballistic missiles for use in prosecuting its illegal war against Ukraine. The transfer poses a direct threat to European security and stability elsewhere, and will increase the suffering of the Ukrainian people. It is this which should be the focus of today's meeting, not Western support for a sovereign state's legitimate and legal right to defend itself. Iranian close-range ballistic missiles will soon reach European soil. The transfer will increase Russia's capability to launch short-range attacks on the front lines, enabling it to use more of its long-distance missiles to strike deeper inside Ukraine. As we said earlier this week, together with our international partners, we can be certain that the suffering of the Ukrainian people will increase as a result. Colleagues, none of us need reminding of the atrocities Russia will inflict with the aid of these weapons. The UN has verified over 35,000 civilian casualties caused by Russia's war. We suspect the real number is far higher. Russian missiles are hitting schools and children's hospitals. Humanitarian workers are being killed. And Russia is cynically and brutally targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, posing significant risks to the lives of millions of Ukrainians ahead of winter. It seems that only one member of this council needs reminding that deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure is a war crime. President, Russia also continues to purchase significant quantities of weapons for use in Ukraine, including ballistic missiles for DPRK, in violation of UN Security Council resolutions Russia itself voted for.
This increased military cooperation between Russia, Iran, and DPRK poses an unacceptable threat not only to European security, but to global security. In return for weapons needed to prolong its illegal war, Russia is violating sanctions endorsed by the UN Security Council and building the capabilities of and emboldening both the Iranian and North Korean regimes. This contributes to further destabilization in the Middle East and Indo-Pacific. Russia's war in Ukraine is a flagrant violation of international law and the UN Charter. We will not be deterred from our unwavering support for Ukraine. We remain committed to providing the political and military support Ukraine requires to defend itself, in line with its Article 51 rights, against Russia's unjustified and unprovoked invasion, and to secure a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. And President, let me conclude with the words of my Prime Minister yesterday. Russia started this conflict. Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. Russia can end this conflict straight away. Ukraine has the right to self-defense. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank the High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Ms. Nakamitsu, for her briefing. As we already spoke on this subject less than a fortnight ago, allow me to briefly restate Switzerland's position in 5 key points. Firstly, the current grave situation is the direct consequence of Russia's military aggression, which we condemn. We will not accept attempts to evade responsibility or to justify such an illegal act. Ukraine has the right to ensure its security and defend its territorial integrity and sovereignty. Secondly, the impact of this war on civilians, civilian infrastructure, and the humanitarian situation is intolerable. Switzerland offers its condolences to the families and loved ones of the 3 ICRC staff members killed yesterday in the Donetsk region. We reiterate that humanitarian personnel must be protected and respected. We condemn all indiscriminate attacks causing civilian casualties. We recall the obligation of all parties to the conflict to strictly respect international humanitarian law, including the rules governing the conduct of hostilities. Violations of international humanitarian law and human rights are unacceptable in all circumstances. Thirdly, we are deeply dismayed by the fact that Russia's military aggression appears to continue to be fueled by third-party transfers of arms and munitions to Russia, including, according to reports, ballistic missiles. Switzerland has always insisted that states must fully respect and comply with their obligations under international arms control agreements. This includes the relevant resolutions of this Council, which are legally binding, but also political commitments aimed at transparency and confidence building. Fourth, sincere efforts are needed to make progress towards a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. As the Acting Undersecretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs stated in this chamber 2 days ago, and I quote, "Protecting civilians and ultimately ending this war is a matter of will," end of quote. Switzerland will continue to engage in good faith discussions aimed at bringing this war to an end in full compliance with the principles of the UN Charter. Fifth, in order to restore respect for the UN Charter, end the suffering, and move towards lasting peace, we once again urge Russia to withdraw all its troops from Ukrainian territory. If the devastation of the past 2.5 years cannot be undone, there is still time to prevent further tragedy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank High Representative Izumi Nakamitsu for her briefing. In the ongoing Ukraine crisis, there's been a steady influx of large quantities of weapons and ammunition into the battlefield, with widening variety and scope, increasing lethality and anti-personnel effectiveness, and a mounting risk of diversion and proliferation. This is worrying. The continued inflow of weapons will only precipitate further escalations and the loss of more civilian lives. It will have an extensive negative impact on international and regional peace and security. China is deeply concerned about the recent spiraling of the intensity of the war. A pressing priority of the moment, in our opinion, is to respect the principles of no spillover, no escalation, and no stoking of the fire by any party, with a view to a swift de-escalation. We call on the parties to the conflict to demonstrate their political will, move in the same direction, put an early end to the hostilities, and relaunch peace talks. We call on the international community to pave the way to this end by providing tangible assistance and facilitation. All parties concerned should put peace and humanity first and rechannel their resources and energies to ending the hostilities through diplomacy. President, the US representative spouted a false narrative in his earlier statement, distorting and vilifying China's position on the Ukraine issue once again, and I feel compelled to respond. China did not create the Ukraine crisis, much less are we a party to the conflict. China has not supplied weapons to either party, and we have consistent and rigorous controls over dual-use items. We maintain normal trade and economic cooperation with all countries around the world, including Russia and Ukraine. China's position on the Ukraine issue is objective and impartial. We do not support anyone, nor do we favor anyone. After the war erupted, we put forward the principled proposition of 4 shoulds. The first of which is that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. And the second of which is that the purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be respected. For over 2 years, China has been working hard to promote peace and encourage and facilitate peace talks. We have stayed engaged with both Russia and Ukraine and have had regular exchanges of views with European countries and the United States. The special representative of the Chinese government on Eurasian affairs made 4 visits to the countries concerned to conduct good offices and mediation. We have done so for the sole purpose of bringing about an early end to the hostilities and restore peace. In May this year, China and Brazil jointly issued a 6-point consensus on the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. It reflects the greatest common denominator of the international community's efforts to resolve the crisis, which has received positive responses from many countries. In addition to the 6-point consensus proposed by China and Brazil, African countries have also contributed a 10-point peace proposal for resolving the crisis. Other countries of the Global South have also put forward similar initiatives. This fully demonstrates that diplomatic negotiations and a political settlement meet the common expectations of the majority of countries and represent the will of the international community. We hope that the United States will not continue to turn a deaf ear to these calls for peace, that it ceases and desists from discrediting and obstructing the diplomatic efforts of China and other countries concerned, undermining international solidarity, creating division and antagonism, and provoking camp-based confrontation, and that it will truly play a constructive role in bringing an early end to the war and achieving peace. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. I wish to thank USG Nakamitsu for her briefing. I would like to make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. Firstly, Slovenia is gravely concerned with the degree to which this war has escalated. It has now been fought on multiple fronts, and reports of violations of neighboring countries' airspaces are becoming commonplace. It is clear at the same time that with higher volumes and with more advanced weaponry, being delivered to the battlefield, the potential for destruction is steadily increasing, and with it, the extent to which reconstruction efforts will be needed. Slovenia stands ready to take part in the efforts to remedy the destruction of the past years and make sure that the full recovery is underway. Let me be clear, however. Every country has the right to defend itself in line with Article 51 of the UN Charter and procure the necessary means to do so. We will not accept victim blaming. You cannot attack a country, occupy parts of its territory, and intimidate its whole population with daily swarms of drones and ballistic missiles, and then say that their suffering is completely of their own doing because they dare to resist. Secondly, discussions like this have the potential to misrepresent the situation on the ground. While we are discussing weapons transfer to Ukraine, Russia is waging a war of aggression. Just yesterday, this war hit another low point, with ICRC's vehicle were subject to a Russian attack, killing and wounding multiple ICRC staff members. We are approaching the discussions on weapons transfer from the wrong end. While transfers to Ukraine are in line with the international legal framework, various reports are suggesting that Russia is replenishing its arsenal by importing missiles and artillery shells from the PRK. This is a clear violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and presents an obvious proliferation risk. In addition to this, Slovenia is deeply concerned with the recently emerged evidence of ballistic missiles transferred from Iran to Russia for use in the war on Ukraine. Such conduct would represent a serious development and an unacceptable act of material support to the ongoing aggression. In conclusion, while all transfers have the potential to intensify the fighting, there is a clear distinction between military aid that supports self-defense and weapons transfer that sustain aggression. With this in mind, my country clearly made its choice and will continue to deliver aid to Ukraine in line with international law. I resume my function as the President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.